All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going deep, really deep into New York City.
Oh, sounds intriguing.
Late 19th century, the 5 Point Slum. You ever heard of it?
The 5 points. Oh, absolutely. A notorious spot in New York's history.
Notorious is putting it mildly. We're talking about a level of poverty and squalor that's hard to even imagine today.
And we have a primary source to guide us, right?
Exactly. Jacob Riis,
Ah, the photojournalist.
the one and only. His work exposed the horrific conditions in these slums, and we're going to be diving specifically into his account of Bandit's Roost.
Now, that's a name that sends shivers down your spine. What makes Reese so fascinating is that he didn't just report the facts and figures.
Right, he went beyond the statistics.
He captured the human side of it all, made you feel what it was like to actually live in these conditions.
And he does that through incredibly vivid descriptions, especially of Mulberry Street.
Mulberry Street. Wasn't Bandit's Roost located on a bend in that street?
Yeah, a sharp bend. That's actually where it got its name.
Ah, I see.
But picture this. Overcrowding, filth, ramshackle tenements, all built on top of, get this, filled-in marshland.
Filled-in marshland. Well, that explains a lot.
It does, doesn't it?
I mean, building on marshland, you're practically guaranteeing dampness, poor sanitation.
A recipe for disease, basically.
Exactly. The very foundation of the neighborhood was setting them up for hardship.
And yet, life found a way to thrive there.
Oh, absolutely. Rees talks about a diverse mix of people.
Italian immigrants, rag pickers, laborers, even criminals.
All trying to make a life for themselves.
And they did, in a way. Rees captures this bustling street life. Markets, children playing, a real sense of community.
It's that resilience that's so striking, isn't it?
Absolutely. It makes you question those assumptions we often have about poverty. Like, there's this one detail that always sticks with me. Rees describes women carrying firewood and babies, almost like a snapshot from another world. And then there's this young girl buying stockings, and this man in patched overalls tries to flirt with her.
It's those little details that really bring it to life.
They remind us that these were real people with real lives, not just statistics.
Exactly. Hopes, dreams, even moments of joy amidst all the struggle.
Exactly. But let's step inside those tenements for a moment. Brace yourself, because Rees's descriptions of the conditions are truly horrifying.
Oh, I can imagine. Cramped, unsanitary.
Entire families crammed into tiny, dark rooms, little to no ventilation.
And sanitation. Forget about it.
It's no surprise that child mortality rates were sky high in the Bend, much higher than the city average.
A direct link between environment and well-being, a lesson we sadly haven't fully learned even today.
It's heartbreaking, really. But you know what's even more disturbing?
What's that?
Rees discovered that some of the worst slum properties were owned by, wait for it, wealthy and influential families.
No way. The hypocrisy is just astounding.
Isn't it? You have these reformers trying to expose the plight of the poor, and then you have this system that's actively profiting from their suffering.
So it wasn't just neglect. These landlords were making a conscious choice to keep people in these conditions.
Exactly. Packing as many people as possible into those dilapidated buildings, resisting any improvements.
Profit over human lives. It makes you question their motives.
It does. Did they truly believe the poor deserve no better? Or was it purely a business decision? A moral dilemma that Rees forces us to confront. It makes you wonder how much those police raids, aimed at curbing overcrowding, actually achieved.
Right, because if the system itself is incentivized to keep people in those slums,
Exactly. Enforcement alone can only do so much.
it speaks to the need for systemic change, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Addressing the root causes, not just the symptoms. Rees actually went on one of those police raids, describes a room packed with lodgers sleeping on the floor like sardines.
Oh, can't even imagine the stench, the lack of air.
But even within this environment, Rees found a glimmer of hope.
Oh, tell me more.
There was this model tenement nearby, built by Christian reformers.
Model tenement, huh? What made it so different?
Well, they believed decent housing could uplift people, break the cycle of poverty.
And it...
Rees compared the mortality rates in the model tenement to those in the slums.
And...
The difference was staggering. Far fewer deaths in the model tenement, proof that even small interventions can have a huge impact.
a powerful argument for social reform.
It shows that change is possible, but it takes a shift in mindset, a willingness to challenge the status quo. But even in the depths of Bandit's Roost, there were those who actively resisted these conditions.
Oh, I bet. Rees must have documented some incredible stories of resilience.
He did. We've talked about the bustling markets, the moments of joy. But there's this other group we need to talk about. The rag picker settlement.
Rag pickers, that was a tough way to make a living.
Even by Bandits Roost standards, it was considered the bottom rung. Families crammed into old sheds, former drying racks. A truly desperate situation.
And yet, Riis still finds stories of courage and defiance there.
Absolutely. He talks about an elderly man who refused to be institutionalized
Yeah.
and a woman who mysteriously disappeared rather than succumb to the pressures of her environment.
It makes you realize that even when it seems like all hope is lost.
People find a way.
Exactly. It highlights that incredible human spirit, but also the vulnerability of those living on the margins, the ones who are easily forgotten or dismissed by society.
And that's exactly why Riis's work is so important. It forces us to see these individuals, to acknowledge their humanity.
To grapple with the systems that perpetuate their suffering.
We've walked the streets, peered into the tenements, met the people. It's been a pretty intense journey so far. What's resonating with you the most?
It's the stark contrast. The resilience of the human spirit on one hand, and then the just utter cruelty of the system on the other. What about you?
I'm really struck by the layers of complexity that Riis uncovers. It's not just about poverty, it's about immigration, urban planning, social responsibility, even the role of photography in all of this.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Right. It's not just a glimpse into the past, it's a reflection on who we are as a society, the choices we make that shape our world, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Well, let's keep going. I'm ready to see how Riis's photography brought all of this to life.
All right, let's dive into the visual world of Bandits Roost and see how Riis used his camera to advocate for change. We were talking about that rag picker settlement, such a tough existence even compared to the rest of Bandits Roost.
A really stark reminder that progress doesn't always reach everyone equally.
It does make you think about who gets left behind, right?
And Riis, he really wanted to highlight those forgotten stories. But what's interesting is he doesn't just present these people as victims, you know?
Right, he showed their strength too.
Exactly, their resilience. Like they managed to create community and hold on to their dignity even in those awful conditions.
Like that elderly man you mentioned earlier.
Oh, the one who refused to go to an asylum.
Yeah, it just shows how much he valued his independence, wanted to stay in control of his own life, even in a place like that.
Absolutely. And then there was that woman who disappeared, choosing, well, we don't know what, but choosing it over staying in the settlement.
Makes you wonder what her story was, right? What led her to that decision? Riis doesn't give us the answers, but he makes us think about those complexities.
Yeah, all those unseen struggles that people face.
Definitely a reminder that there's always more to the story than just the statistics.
Way more.
Speaking of stories, people still had to make a living in Bandits Roost, right? What kind of work were they doing?
Lots of laborers working in factories or on the docks. Long hours, tough conditions.
For very little pay, I imagine.
Exactly. But people did what they had to. Some turned to street vending, others to rag picking, even crime.
Riis mentions a real mix of people in those back alleys.
Oh yeah, every walk of life. You'd have artisans next to pickpockets, all trying to scrape by.
It's almost entrepreneurial in a way, isn't it?
Absolutely. When your survival's on the line, you get creative.
Riis talks about these shops set up in hallways, barely any space to move.
Try to picture it, that constant hustle and bustle, everyone determined to make something of themselves.
Even in those conditions?
It wasn't just about surviving, though. It was about holding on to a sense of normalcy, of community.
Right. Riis talks about those social gatherings.
Exactly. Markets, street vendors, people connecting with each other.
Showing that even amidst hardship, people still crave that connection. It's a basic human need.
For sure.
I noticed Riis also mentioned religious icons in a lot of those shops. What do you make of that?
Those little patron saints. I think it gives us a peek into their faith.
Seeking some kind of comfort, maybe?
Yeah, solace, protection, maybe a little bit of hope in a world that felt pretty chaotic. It shows how important faith was for many of them, even in a place like Bandits Roost.
It adds another layer to their lives, doesn't it? Makes them even more human.
It does. Speaking of adding layers, we talked about landlords earlier and their role in all of this.
Right, the ones profiting from the misery.
Yeah, recent investigation showed that a lot of those awful slum buildings, they were owned by some pretty prominent families.
Wealthy families, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a case of ignoring the problem. They were part of a system that kept people trapped in poverty.
Just for their own profit.
They crammed tenants into rundown buildings, refused to make repairs, all to squeeze out every last penny.
It's a story that still resonates today, unfortunately.
Sadly, yes. It makes you think about who has the power and what their responsibility is, especially when it comes to something as basic as housing.
Riis was a strong advocate for decent housing.
Yeah.
He saw it as a basic human right.
Absolutely. He wanted people to understand that poverty wasn't some moral failing, It was the result of a system that kept people down.
So he was shifting the focus, moving away from blaming the individuals and looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. It wasn't about those poor people. It was about a broken system. And that's what makes his work so important.
It wasn't just documenting the problem, he was pushing for solutions.
Right. He highlighted the efforts of reformers, the model tenements, the push for better education and healthcare. Remember how he contrasted those model tenements with the slums?
Yeah, the mortality rates were dramatically different.
Exactly. And it proved his point. Better housing meant healthier lives, especially for the children. It's like a case study in how much even small changes can matter.
Makes you wonder why that model wasn't adopted everywhere.
Oh, there you hit on a major obstacle. A lot of people, especially those powerful landlords, they didn't want things to change.
Because it would cut into their profit.
Exactly. Plus, there was this mindset that poverty was the individual's fault, a lack of willpower or something.
So even with evidence right in front of them.
Some people just couldn't or wouldn't see the need for change. It's about power, entrenched interests getting in the way of progress.
But Riis didn't let that stop him, did he?
Absolutely not. He knew change was never easy. It takes constant pushing, challenging the way things are, and believing that collective action can make a difference.
And that's where his photography comes in.
Right. Those powerful images, they reached people in a way words couldn't.
Bringing the reality of Bandit's Roost to light. Literally. With his use of flash photography.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part.
I can't wait to dive into that. It seems like Riis was a real trailblazer, using visual storytelling to make a real impact, almost like a precursor to modern-day photojournalists.
Absolutely. He knew a picture could speak 1,000 words, especially when it came to evoking empathy.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, what are your thoughts on the legacy of Riis's work? Not just back then, but today.
That's a great question. I think what makes Riis so important is how he connected the personal stories to the larger political issues.
He showed that even in a big, bustling city, these problems had a human face.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that compassion, social responsibility, those things mattered.
Makes you appreciate the power of art to drive change, right?
Oh, absolutely. Riis's work is a powerful reminder that stories can eliminate injustice and inspire action.
Okay, let's take a breath for a second and reflect on what we've learned about Bandit's Roost so far.
I'm just in awe of that resilience, that ability to find hope and connection, even in the midst of so much hardship.
It really makes you appreciate the strength of community, doesn't it? And faith. And that drive to build a better life for yourself and your family. What about you? What's sticking with you?
It's the complexity of it all. It's not just good or bad, simple solutions. There are so many layers to this story.
Riis doesn't shy away from the harsh realities, but he also shows us those moments of joy, of kindness, of people trying to make things better.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even in the toughest situations, things aren't always black and white.
And that finding solutions means understanding the nuances, the different forces at play.
Well said. And that leads us perfectly into the final part, where we explore how Riis used photography to try and make a difference.
Right, let's delve into his photographs and see how he used those images to fight for change. We've really gotten to know Bandit's Roost through Riis's writing.
Yeah, his words paint a vivid picture.
But as we've been saying, he was much more than a writer.
Oh, absolutely. A true pioneer.
He used photography, a pretty new medium back then, to really expose what was happening in these slums.
He was an early photojournalist, you could say.
Exactly. And he understood that images could have an even deeper impact than words alone.
They could reach people on a different level.
Make them feel something,
And he was one of the first to use flash photography.
Bringing those dark corners into the light, literally.
Yeah, imagine how shocking those images must have been for people who'd never seen anything like that.
People who had no idea what it was like to live in those slums.
Suddenly, poverty wasn't just an abstract concept. It was right there in front of them. Real people in real pain.
Speaking of powerful photos, there's one that always sticks with me. Bandit's Roost, I think it's called.
Oh, I know the one with those men huddled together in the alleyway.
Yeah, some of them are wearing bowler hats. It's a bit unsettling.
It really captures the atmosphere of the place, doesn't it? That sense of danger, the lawlessness.
It's chilling.
But Riis was quick to point out that those men, they weren't necessarily criminals.
Right. They were just trying to survive, like everyone else.
He wanted people to look beyond the stereotypes, to see the humanity in these individuals.
It's easy to judge when you're on the outside looking in.
But Riis's photos, they break down those barriers.
They force you to confront the reality of poverty, to see those faces, to recognize their shared humanity.
Exactly. He believed that seeing those faces would spark empathy, understanding.
And that's such a powerful tool for change.
Absolutely.
So his photos weren't just about documentation, they were about action.
Oh, absolutely. He was a fierce advocate for better housing, sanitation, social programs, the whole 9 yards.
Did his work lead to any specific changes, do we know? Like any new laws or programs?
It's hard to say for sure, but there's no doubt his work had a major impact.
People were talking about these issues, finally.
Right. His photos, his writing, his lectures, they all helped to shift the conversation.
He really was a driving force for social reform.
And that's incredible, especially considering the time period.
So even if we can't point to one specific law or program,
His influence is undeniable.
he brought these issues into the light and pushed people to care, to do something about it.
Exactly. And that legacy, it lives on today.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And not
yeah.
just in his photos, but in the ongoing fight for justice, for a fairer world.
We're still grappling with many of the same issues, even now.
Which is why Riis's work is still so relevant, I think.
It reminds us that we can't turn away from these problems, that we all have a responsibility to make things better.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Bandit's Roost, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will remember?
Well, I hope they come away with a deeper understanding of poverty, how complex it is, how systemic it is, and how resilient people can be in the face of it.
That resilience is really something.
It is, and I also hope they're inspired by Riis's commitment to justice, his belief in the power of storytelling to create change.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Bandit's Roost may be a forgotten corner of history.
But the lessons we've learned here, those are timeless and universal.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that hope can exist even in the darkest of times.
And that every single one of us has the power to make a difference in the world.
Sometimes all it takes is one person, one camera, one voice to shine a light on injustice.
And to inspire others to fight for a better future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating journey.